Welcome. My name is David Webster. I'm an occupational and coaching psychologist and director of the Centre for Teams, and I have my colleague here, Chris Sheepshanks. And between us, we have 20 years experience of working with senior leaders and their teams. And we've been, over the last couple of weeks, spending quite a bit of time thinking about how we'll support our clients through what we see as an extraordinary time of change. So here in this series called Adapt, we have some practical insight and guidance for you. And this first one in the series is entitled, What the Feck? What the Feck is going on? And that takes a bit of humor from the Father Ted series in doing so. So welcome, Chris. What's your response to this central question that we're asking in this webinar? What the feck is going on?
David, thank you. I think my first response is probably to agree with you. I'm probably asking the same thing. I do think that actually all of us are probably highly confused, probably a bit bewildered. I think we are all managing to think about how we respond to what is a seismic shift in how we're working and how we're operating. And I'm really aware in even speaking into this that while for some of us, we are simply adapting to new ways of working and to change, for others, I'm deeply aware that they are thinking about survival. I think in sort of trying to answer that question, what's probably quite useful is to remember that actually thinking about how we as leaders or as teams respond to this sort of change and what might be described as quite a hostile environment is not actually anything that new. Maybe new in terms of its scale and scope, but it's actually been going on for quite some time. And a way of perhaps describing what the feck is going on is through the use of a word or a term called VUCA, a mnemonic standing for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I'm really aware that that term has become a bit more fashionable in the last few years and quite, from my experience, loosely applied. But I think actually in this time, it's quite useful to remember that actually it came from not a group of academics, but actually from military strategists. And it was very much applied to how do you support military commanders on the ground in a hostile environment to be prepared to respond and lead well when things go south. And it's sort of summed up by an old quote from, or maxim from a Prussian general called Moltke, which says, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And the real actual question for us, and I think for military commanders, has been, how do you understand how to operate in such an environment? And in doing so, probably worth just looking at some of the terms and what they really mean, because volatility means things are moving very fast all the time. And I'm sure we can all appreciate and have our own experience of that, and the recognition that it's very disorientating and can create a lot of confusion and bewilderment. High levels of uncertainty means that we don't always really know what's really happening, or indeed, for a lot of us at the moment, when it's going to end. And that can create perhaps a rising tide of fear and self-doubt and anxiety, which can really inhibit focus. High levels of complexity means there is an exponential increase in the level of data and information that needs to be considered and processed. And a recognition within that that the normal ways of operating actually no longer seem relevant and often are of no use to us, which can create a hesitancy in actually how decisions are made in the fear of getting it wrong. And ambiguity, within a military term sometimes described as the fog of war, means actually it's really hard to grasp what's really happening. And as a result, very hard to get some sense of a direction forward. That's one take, David, on what the feck is happening.
So with these ideas of volatility and uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, we can start to get a grip on not just what's happening and make sense of it, but also what our response might be and how to avoid those traps that you've just been describing. You've got some personal experience of in a fairly unusual environment for many of us. Might be useful to give us an example so we can get some insight into that.
David, thank you. I'm quite sure actually all of us have our own experience and learning that it may be useful at this time to remember and to draw upon. Mine is that a recognition that all of that situation I described and the consequences that I outlined can be real traps to fall into if we don't fundamentally appreciate that things have really changed. A poet called Eliot once said, "Humankind cannot bear too much reality." And the psychological proposition of that is that we tend to shy away from really facing into what is really happening. And my experience is actually that's what we need to do at this time. We need to face into it. And my experience is that when you do, remarkable things can happen. So as a soldier in the 90s, I'm very well. I had far less operational experience than many of my colleagues who stayed on have had to endure over the last 20 years. But a profound lesson for me was, for all the many, many months of training and preparation for an operational environment, for all the fact that we thought we knew exactly what our job was and we were really clear on the dangers that it involved, it wasn't until actually we had a contact, the first time actually somebody tried to blow us up, that the true reality of that really struck home. And the impact of that experience for myself and for those I was working with was quite a fundamental shift in attitude and approach. People got it very, very quickly, that this was very real and the consequences were very real. You couldn't go back to an old mindset. This was happening to us right now. And actually that required us to respond differently. And as a result, what I noticed is, for all the checks and balances I had to do in commanding, things were already done. Things had already been attended to because everyone got it. And that's the piece for me, probably the biggest lesson. Face into reality and accept actually what's happening, because it's only once you've done so that you can really begin to think about how you respond.
So what would be your key takeaways in that case from this idea of the VUCA environment and the example that you shared for the modern leader and for the modern senior team?
I think there are three quick things, David. So the first one is the recognition that a VUCA environment is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be accepted. And the sooner you do that, the quicker you can actually understand how you want to respond to it. But you need to face into it first and all its potential stark consequences. The second piece is really own what you can control and what you can't. If you can actually center yourself on actually what you can control, my experience is it will keep you focused, because it's all too easy in these circumstances to begin to focus on actually what we can't affect and forget to actually look at what we can control. The third point is a recognition that actually you won't get it right first time. So actually manage your expectations of yourself and of others. And our experience, I think, is if you can remain curious, if you can look for actually what is your learning each time you go through each of these experiences, you will actually learn to be more adaptive and as a result more resilient in working through the difficult times we're in.
So 3 key takeaways then: face into the reality and accept it, exert control over the things that you do have control over, and learn as you go. Those three key takeaways.
Thank you, David. Exactly.
Perfect. Chris, thanks very much. We hope that everybody out there has an opportunity to feed back into these sessions. Chris and I look forward to you joining us in the future. Thanks very much.